This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. It's primary day here in Connecticut, and we're watching several key mayoral races to see who will be on the ballot in November. But historically, voter turnout tends to be pretty low on primary days, especially on years where we don't have a big presidential election. According to the Associated Press, turnout for the 2019 Democratic mayoral primaries in Bridgeport, Hartford, and New Haven all hovered between 13 and 15%. Today, we hear how some educators are getting their students more engaged in the electoral process. We'll also check in with one of our reporters at a local polling station and learn what they're hearing from voters. But first, primary day in Connecticut looks a little different than other parts of the country. Here to answer all of your questions about primary day is Dr. Trish Crouse. She's the professor of political science at the University of New Haven. Trish, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thank you. Good morning.
And for our listeners, how do you see the role of primary elections? Let us know, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So Trish, tell us, what does primary day look like in Connecticut, and how is that different from other parts of the country?
It really depends on, like you were saying about turnout, it is generally very, very low in a primary, how much people are invested in a particular race. Connecticut is a closed primary state, so we only allow people who are either registered Democrats or registered Republicans to vote in a primary, and you have to vote in your party's primary, meaning you can't cross over, as a Democrat and vote in the Republican primary. And people who are unaffiliated voters, if they want to vote in a primary, they have to change their affiliation, and then they could change it back afterwards. So, in that sense, it gives the parties a little more control over who's voting in a primary, because they know it's just their voters coming out to vote in a particular primary.
And can you talk about, why do we have closed primaries here?
Well, again, I think it's a way for parties to control the elections. So, if you look at other states that have open primaries, and, in the state of Virginia, when you register to vote, you don't even declare a party. And then when you go to vote in a primary, you can vote in the Republican primary, you can vote in the Democratic primary. So it's a way for parties to be able to make sure that it's just their voters who are voting for particular candidates. There's something called crossover voting, which means that sometimes if you have more of an open primary system, the parties will encourage their voters to vote in the other primary to try to put up a weaker candidate against their candidate, if that makes sense,
Right.
So, parties do not like when something like that happens.
And it's so interesting because it, like we were saying earlier, it really varies
Right.
depending on the
Yes.
states and the races. So not everyone can participate in the primaries here. You have to be registered as a Democrat or a Republican. Is there any pushback against this at all?
I haven't seen any. I talked to people who are unaffiliated voters. Obviously, this is nothing, driven by science. But I talked to voters who say, it's kind of a pain for them that if they do want to vote in a primary, they must declare a party. A lot of unaffiliated voters, don't want to do that, so they'll simply opt out of a primary. It's more, I think, considered an inconvenience. So, there's no major push to change that in the state of Connecticut. And some states do accommodate independent voters or unaffiliated voters. They do allow them to vote as an independent or an unaffiliated voter in their primaries. But I think it just depends on, the state and California, I believe, does that. They allow independent or unaffiliated voters to vote in their primaries. But California is, a huge state, and their politics is very, very different than the state of Connecticut. So I think a lot of it does have to do with the parties in the state, the politics of the state. And I just don't see a huge trend here for that to change, to make it any different than a closed primary state.
Right. And then you mentioning unaffiliated, I think there's a rising number of young Americans who want political independence and are choosing to be
Right.
unaffiliated. So is this coming primarily from young voters you're seeing, or what are you seeing in that aspect?
As being unaffiliated, you mean?
Yeah, for especially for young Americans who
Yeah,
want a
no,
little bit more
I would say
independence.
I would say that that's accurate. A lot of my students are between the ages of 18 and 22. And I would say that, you know, most of them do register as unaffiliated because they don't want to be directly associated with either party because their views just don't align closely enough with either the Democrats or the Republicans for them to want to label themselves as a Democrat or Republican. So I think for the younger voters, it just gives them the freedom to be able to make choices in terms of voting. Um, when you talk about the difference between sort of younger generation and the older generation in voting, the older generation just tends to be more sort of set in their views. And so it's easier for the older generation to gravitate towards one part or the other. I just don't see that in my younger voters.
And because this year is primarily about mayoral races, so what is primary day going to look like this year in Connecticut, you think?
Well, I mean, I see there's three important races where you may see sort of an uptick in outcome, voter outcome. And that's Bridgeport, Hartford, and West Haven. Luke Bronin didn't run again. So you have, I believe, three Democratic candidates who are vying for the nomination for that party. The Democrats have backed one particular candidate. That doesn't necessarily mean that he's the one that's going to win. And then you have Ganim in Bridgeport. Some people felt like he shouldn't have been able to get back into office because of his criminal background. So you have, I believe, also in Bridgeport, at least three candidates vying for that nomination. And then in West Haven, you have a completely open race, which is something that really kind of opens up an election when you have, an incumbent steps down or decides not to run again. So I think that those three races are definitely worth watching. But I think generally speaking, most people don't really pay that much attention to primaries. And turnout is very low and interest is very low. You mentioned 13 and 15%. Even in a general election, when you're talking about local elections, that's about average turnout as well once you actually go into a general election. So it's not necessarily primaries, it's interest in local elections in general.
Right. And we'll certainly talk about the interest in elections in a little bit on the show. But I mean, you kind of answered my next question in terms of, what do you think the turnout for primary day might be? But it also relates to the general election, especially in a non-presidential year. Do you think that has a correlation because it is a non-presidential year?
Yeah, I mean, we know that. We know that people, local elections average anywhere between, believe it or not, like 7 and maybe 30% turnout. And then when you get to a midterm election, it averages usually between 20 to 40%. And then you get to a presidential election year, and it's been averaging between 50 to 60% turnout. So the higher the turnout, the more interest there is in that particular election. And usually that's because you're talking about higher up elections, federal elections. Local elections just don't garner the same interest, which is unfortunate because really the local elections are the ones that most directly impact our lives. We think about the federal elections and we think about the president's office and Congress. But when we're talking about sort of direct connections to decisions that are made that impact our lives every day, those really come from the local level and some from the state level. And yet people just don't pay that close attention to any of these because sometimes they don't even know who these people are. So I think that's part of the problem is they're just not invested.
Right. And so especially with local elections, I mean, even though the turnout is low, numbers are low, but could a small amount of votes determine the outcome of some of these elections?
Oh, absolutely. I live in a small town. We have a board of selectmen. We have other boards. We have a wetlands board. We have a zoning board. But the biggest turnout usually in my town is for budget votes, which we do separately from elections. And that depends on the town, whether they vote for a budget separately or not. But, we've had budgets either rejected or approved by one vote. So this idea that it doesn't matter whether I come out and vote or not, I think when you're talking about local levels is absolutely false. You could actually be the determining vote of whether something passes or fails. And our local elections here are very, very competitive. They're not in every town, but it really depends, what's happening on the micro level. So towns vary, states vary, politics vary. It really just depends on, how much you know about what's going on in your own town. So for a town like mine, people pay attention. But that doesn't happen in every town, and that's why you have such low turnout.
And so we've been talking about voters. I also want to talk about the people that are actually sitting on the dais. People holding elective office tend to be a little older. And according to the Pew Research Center, the median age of voting House lawmakers is 57.9 years. So the question is, are we going to need more people to fill these positions, especially we're talking, local politics as well, to step down and retire to allow the younger generation to come and take up those posts?
Yeah, and I think actually that number you just quoted, I think that's actually gone down significantly, which tells you a lot about, how quickly change can happen.
Right.
I think the problem is not so much having people step down, it's getting younger people interested in actually running. And the contact that I have with my students, they don't seem to have a lot of interest in being in politics. They're interested in learning about the politics and the process and the institutions of government, but actually being a part of, Congress or a local board or something like that, I just don't see a lot of interest in that. So we need to do a better job. And I know you're going to talk to a couple of teachers later on about, civic education. And that's why I think civic education can be so, so important in the schools, because we need to make students want to be a part of the process, so that we do have younger people actually running for office and being able to get elected. And I don't see that right now. So what happens is you get people who get sort of embedded in the system, particularly at the local level. And obviously we see this at the federal level with Congress. But, people get comfortable with the people that are running their towns, and they just simply keep reelecting the same people. So, I think that change has to come from academia. It has to come, a little bit from your home life, being socialized by parents or whoever's raising you, to sort of want to be more invested in politics.
And this is one of those intangible questions, I feel like, but what can, especially at the college level too, because you do have the older students, or talk about students, what can you do to encourage young people to vote, especially in these local races? Because as we're having this conversation, I'm having flashbacks to ads and promos from MTV way back when, where they had a campaign that was like vote or die, and you've got all these celebrities come out to encourage college age students to come out and vote. But I remember learning that the stats actually didn't change. So, besides that, what else can you do to encourage young people to vote?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has to do with how we present elections to the younger generation. When I teach it and when I talk about it in class, I talk a lot about sort of, again, at the micro level. I'm like, okay, so in your town, that you need a stoplight, but there's, nobody's pushing to get a stoplight, but you can go to your town council meeting, or you can go to your board of selectmen meeting and ask for a new stoplight, and you get the process rolling, and you can be, directly involved in whether you get a stoplight in your town or not. And I know that's very basic, but it's this idea that you do have a voice there, but you have to be willing to step up and use it. When elections roll around, I pull up the ballots and I ask my students, what town are you from? And I pull up the ballot and I show them who's on the ballot. And I'm like, if you don't know any of these people, then do a little research, find out, who you think is the best candidate. Even out of state students, I'll point to their, either Secretary of State page or, their government's, their town government's page. When I taught state and local government, I used to have my students, they had to write a paper on the system of government in their town. Some of them have never looked at that before. So that's why I think, as an educator, I have a big responsibility to make them aware of the impact that they can have. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the older generation, they look at the younger generation and they see social media and they see, apathetic, lazy students. And I don't see that at all. I see students who are just waiting for somebody to explain the process to them. And I've had so many students over the course of teaching. I've been teaching for 16 years who have said to me, I never even thought about voting until I took your class. And now that I understand what my role is, they get excited about voting. So that's the kind of thing that I think we need to do.
Well, thanks so much, Trish, for explaining the process to us today and being on the show. You've been listening to Trish Crouse, who is a professor of political science at the University of New Haven. Thanks so much, Trish.
Thank you.
And you can check out our voter guide and learn where you can vote today by visiting ctpublic.org. And coming up next, we're hearing from Connecticut social studies teachers, and we want to hear from you too. Let us know if you regularly vote on primary day, and do you think people should be allowed to vote in the primary regardless of their party affiliation? Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Political misinformation and distrust in the electoral process has become a huge obstacle in getting eligible voters to show up to the polls. Some educators say the answer to that problem is better civic education. Joining us now to talk about what they're doing to keep students engaged are two Connecticut social studies teachers. Dr. David Bosso is a social studies teacher at Berlin High School, and he was the 2012 Connecticut Teacher of the Year. And Julia Miller is a civics teacher at Metropolitan Business Academy Interdistrict Magnet School in New Haven. Thank you both so much for being on this show this morning.
Thanks so much for having us.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And for our callers, you can join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And Julia, I want to start with you. You teach civics, so can you tell us, what exactly does that curriculum have?
Sure, yeah. There are absolutely elements of a kind of traditional, let's learn about government and three branches and, those kind of things that you would expect. But I think civics education is so much more than that. So, I have an entire unit about voting and elections. Also, I end the year having students learn about social movements and how people can make change that way, right? Because in learning about democracy, it looks so many different ways. And so that means voting, that means understanding how the government works, that representatives really are supposed to work for you, and looking at how individuals and groups can make change. So I think it can be so encompassing and beyond what a traditional government class people might think is.
Right. And we will dig deeper into that in a little bit. But based on what you just said, I want to ask, especially with a lot of social movements and whatnot's happening as you're teaching the classes, do you find that to resonate with your students? And are they more interested in the process because they have live examples to sort of follow with?
Yes, I really think that is true. Our students all just lived through 2020 and after George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movement. And so they have firsthand knowledge, and many of them are activists in their own right. And so connecting what they're seeing, their own experiences, to how these movements have worked in the past, and evaluating those two in conversation with each other, I really think absolutely helps students feel more engaged.
And because I always feel like live examples are really helpful to understand processes that you read about in a textbook. So what does teaching the electoral process look like?
Sure. In terms of the electoral process, listening to Trish before and the idea about why voting matters and turnout and how your vote can make a difference. My day one lesson of our voting and elections unit is really about that. And we look at statistics about how such small percentages of votes can make a difference in an election outcome. And even the ideas about you're not voting is actually making a choice, right? You're letting other people then make decisions that are going to affect your life. So I really ground it in that. And we look at voting history, how, the history of suffrage amendments and enfranchisement, disenfranchisement, but then also the ins and outs of the electoral process. So, at a presidential election, of course, we're learning about the Electoral College, which students are always astounded by, and then sometimes have to combat the feeling of like, wait, so does my vote really matter, right? And so having lots of discussions, teaching about primaries, which is, I know why we're here today, is so important. Students don't always know that those even exist. And so also in terms of student engagement, even teaching students the process of how one might run for office and the ins and outs of, getting signatures to get on the ballot. And so it's really expansive, I think, and informing students of all of those different aspects of our electoral system.
And is getting students to be interested in the electoral process a challenge? Especially you just mentioned them being astounded by the Electoral College. So how do you address that kind of, moments where they could feel disconnected or disengaged? So, with our sort of theme about talking about getting students to want to go out to vote. So how do you have those conversations with students?
Yeah, I definitely have students who say like, well, this doesn't affect my life. And what I might do is ask them what they care about, what they feel passionate about, and then see how that can relate to folks in government who are making laws about some of these issues they really care about. And the idea of how present it is in their life, and especially in a representative democracy, I'm going to go back to the conversation that you had with Trish before, but in terms of like local government and people generally, and especially young people as well, not knowing necessarily their elected officials locally, that's one of the things that we do as well. So we're an interdistrict magnet, so we have students from New Haven, mostly, majority New Haven, but cities and towns all over. And I do local government scavenger hunt, and so that they are learning about their local government and literally looking up who is your alder, what do you care about in your neighborhood. I have on the front of my classroom, it says, know your reps, they work for you. And I literally have Rosa DeLaura's office numbers, and same with our senators, and tell students, put these numbers in your phone. If there is an issue you care about, you can call them. And so I really try to make students understand that this is about them and the issues that they care about, and that often change starts right with like individuals and group movements, and then to make the lasting impact, it has to be brought into legislation, and they can be a piece that contributes to that.
I love that you're using modern technology as a part of this, because it just makes so much sense. It should be something that's so simple. It just seems genius to me. And of course, your students are learning about this in the classroom. So how are you helping students with basic things too, like learning how to register to vote? Because eventually they'll get there.
Yeah. So I teach juniors, so they're close to the age of registering to vote. One thing I actually, at 16, a lot of students are very interested in getting their licenses. That's a big talk of the town. And so I tell them, you can register to vote at the DMV. I also have paper copies that I like to have in my classroom. And I even tell students, even though you might not be able to register to vote now, you might have an older sibling or a cousin. Let's talk to them as well. And so that kind of also showing them literally the link online of where you can register to vote. So I do think that, it doesn't have to be clouded in mystery. These are available to us, and just showing students the ways is really important.
And David, I want to bring you into the conversation with what we're just saying too. Julia mentioning earlier that being able to teach students with live sort of social movements going on, this next generation certainly seems interested in activism. But so what about their interest in the process, in the electoral process? What sentiments about voting or even running for office have your students echoed?
I totally agree with Julia. We've definitely seen an increased awareness, more of a desire for activism. Students are getting a better sense of the impact that they can have. At the same time, however, unfortunately, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because I think a lot of students have also either personally witnessed or on social media, they've seen a lot of the ugliness. They've seen a lot of the just intense criticism that's happened at not only the national level, but at the local level, at boards of education meetings. And of course, sometimes when issues are contentious, there's far more interest in it. But at the same time, that can be very discouraging, because getting involved in your local government, but knowing that it might even be a volunteer position and you're going to face an awful lot of criticism, that's a tough balance. So at the same time, I think a lot of students, again, are very much aware. There's a desire to be active, and not only can we teach about the process, but we can teach about the impact.
I mean, I've certainly have way more experience than I ever thought I would have by talking to young activists. And then at the same time, it's really exciting to see them out there advocating for themselves. But it's also kind of sad to see them having to do that because they have to. So on that note, what are some of the challenges that you face teaching elections in this time period that we're in? How has that changed and evolved?
Well, I think we've, as social studies teachers, had to take a broader view in a lot of ways. I mean, we're faced with the perennial quandary that social studies face, and that is how much content we cover in a certain amount of time, but then also how do we connect current events and situate it in a historical context that is engaging and makes things more interesting and just meaningful to students' lives. And so we are obviously continuing to get students to critically analyze situations, to ask questions, and we do see, over the course of their time in high school, just a more enhanced skill set in terms of being able to more critically analyze and engage in inquiry. And so when it comes to the right to vote, as Julia was saying earlier, an understanding of the history of enfranchisement, the fact that so many groups have been disenfranchised, and students, it's very eye-opening for students when they start to see some of the very horrific tactics that were used to keep people from voting, like literacy tests and poll taxes. And to realize that was not that long ago, and that there are current issues, of course, and current challenges that are maybe preventing people from voting. So when they can connect some of these current challenges and see that thread weave through history, it becomes that much more fascinating for them.
And Julia, I want to pose a similar question to you too. How has how you taught the electoral process changed and evolved over the years? And what are some of the challenges that you face too, teaching elections in this time period that we're in?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely feels like a pre and post Trump era, and with teaching, I remember very clearly the day after the 2016 election, and I had students who had family members who were undocumented, who were truly afraid and literally in tears. I had some students whose parents were Trump supporters. And how do we hold all of these, strong feelings in one place together? And I ended up scrapping the lesson that I had planned for that day and actually leading a circle. So it's definitely wading into, it's not just looking at this as an academic level, but the emotions that are involved as well is something that I think one needs to grapple with. And so, I think it's important to bring in primary sources, multiple perspectives, and allow students to do kind of the inquiry work and come to their own conclusions.
And I want to ask both of you this, but starting with Julia, we talk about live examples, and I think there's so much information out there that I did not go through when I was growing up and learning about elections. How do you have conversations with your students around misinformation and voter intimidation, like David mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I was glad that David spoke about that, because that's actually a comparison that I absolutely do as well, looking at disenfranchisement efforts from the past and then modern day voter suppression. And so I do think it's important for students to be informed in what's happening, right, so that they can fight against it. Actually, I tell students that my goal for them in civics is to be informed so that they feel empowered to make change. And this kind of brings us full circle in terms of being engaged in the voting process. You can elect folks that are going to then pass laws that are going to affect you, right? And that could be in terms of suppressing the vote, or it could be in terms of making voting more accessible. And the idea that there's a role in that. I think I lost the original thread of your question.
You're on the thread. You're still on the thread, so that's for sure. But how do you have conversations around misinformation with your students?
Oh, the misinformation.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, thank you. We definitely also talk about what makes a reliable source. And so building in whole lessons about what to look for. And, we even do website analysis. And so we talk about, okay, what is there an about us section, right? Who wrote this? Are there citations? Is this a reliable news source? And so many of our students are getting news from social media through Instagram and TikTok. And I will sometimes have students say, oh my gosh, Miss, did you hear about X? And it's this far-fetched idea, but all these students are talking about it because it's spreading on social media. And so we have to talk about, what Instagram post did you see? Where did they get their information? And so it's absolutely something that happens both in actual instruction and creating full lessons about evaluating sources and what makes a reliable source. And then also in just conversations that come up, like, look what I saw on TikTok.
David, I'm going to throw this question to you too. So how do you talk to your students around misinformation and voter intimidation?
Very much the same way. We certainly focus on media literacy, being able to evaluate sources, to recognize bias, to get an understanding of the context of the source, where it's from, who wrote it. Certainly the idea of recognizing just the whole concept of echo chambers and how that can influence even just the algorithms that show up, and how that influences people's news feeds. Recognizing one's own bias. The whole idea of talking about there's multiple perspectives on an issue, but at the same time, as social studies teachers, as educators in general, we have an obligation to pursue the truth. And so every once in a while, conspiracy theories will kind of rise up, and we have to again address that in a way that we have an imperative to focus on the truth. I think it's important also to talk with students about how politicized things have become, how polarized things have become. And I think they're aware of that, but at the same time, that there are more moderate voices that sometimes get drowned out by the extremist views, and those are the ones who tend to dominate on whatever social media or media that they might be interested in.
And Julia, I know you built your classroom with so much local politics information, which I think is amazing to see the photos and the posters and whatnot's going into your classroom. But I think most students, in fact, come in with more of a familiarity with the presidential election. So obviously with your amazing classroom, how do you sort of continue to get them interested in local politics?
Yeah, that's very true. I actually give a little survey the start of the year, just kind of gathering their civic knowledge. And I ask, what are positions that one might run for office? And it's always president first, right? I usually get a governor or mayor, but Congress perhaps, but I never am seeing city council or, some of these more local offices when they're coming into class. I do think real life examples are so important. This was, I want to bring this series back now a little bit more post-pandemic. A few years ago, had invited Justin Farmer, who's city councilor from Hampton, and Will Haskell, the state senator from the Westport region, as young elected officials in to talk to my students. I had them speak with the whole junior class to say, like, as young, they were, young when they were elected, as young people, how did they get into politics? Why did they do it? What is the experience like? And to show students these real life examples of people in their state, in their community, who are entering into this work. So I do think the literacy piece of just understanding local government, but then also giving examples and human stories connected is really important as well.
And having this conversation, I'm also wondering too, one of the things that students can do is join the student council or school government and whatnot. So by giving students a voice on how their school operates or things that they can control, what does that look like?
I'm so glad you brought that up. I actually also the advisor for our junior student council, and here in New Haven, it's a great system. So, we have student council by grade. And then we have citywide student council. So once a month, students from the various student councils in each building get to go to a citywide student council where our they're non-voting, but members of our Board of Education are there. And, the hyperlocal student councils are gathering what students care about and issues that they want to see change at the school level. They're bringing it to the citywide student council. And then our student representatives on the Board of Ed are bringing it there. And so students are getting to see that modeled in a way that affects their daily lives to a T, right? Being in the school. We also have a school planning management team, which is like our governance counselor in our building. And we invite student council members to be part of that and come give reports and be part of the conversation. So I really am glad you brought that up, because I think that that's such a good way for students to learn how being part of a system like this, that you can make a change and help also represent your peers. So I think that's really important.
And here, just a quick ask for our listeners. Are you voting in today's primary? And how do you see the role of primaries? Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Just want to add that the League of Women Voters commented on Facebook that there's even a special day for it, though any day is a good day to register to vote. Tuesday, September 19th is National Voter Registration Day. We also have a comment from Rich from North Haven, who said, I think eliminating closed primaries is important because politics have moved so far from center. Allowing, for example, a Democrat to vote for a centrist Republican would help prevent extremism on each end. Well, thank you, both the League of Women Voters and Rich from North Haven, for commenting today. And of course, we're speaking on primary day. Julia, I want to ask, what will your curriculum look like today?
Well, today I'm actually not teaching. New Haven has primary day off for students. So teachers have professional learning. But tomorrow I will definitely we'll be talking about the results here in New Haven as a very Democratic town. The mayoral Democratic primary can often be determining in what's going to happen in the general election. So I had already showed students clips from the debate between the two candidates on the ballot, and we'll do some debriefing.
Well, today, tomorrow, it's important to do either day anyway. And I have one last question that I want to ask both of you. I want to start with David, though. How do we ensure that every student gets a firm grasp of the electoral process and civics education?
Well, one way we ensure that is, of course, in Connecticut, we have a mandated civics course for requirement for graduation. And so in my school, for example, we have it's sophomore year, that is offered, and then students will take a U.S. History junior year. I know in a lot of other schools that it might be a little bit later in their high school career, perhaps because of that relationship with being able to register to vote. And this is becoming, I've noticed a trend throughout the nation where more and more states are requiring some type of civics requirement for graduation. In some cases, it takes the form of a test. That's not the case here in Connecticut. And that becomes a different conversation about, do we attach a high stakes test to it? But at the same time, I think it's important for students to have a pretty good grasp on the nature of government, their rights and responsibilities as citizens, understanding that, as Julia and Tricia both mentioned, how important it is for them to be involved in a process that, in many cases, immediately affects them. So there's a lot that we can do as social studies teachers in general that focuses not only on the ideals, but in many cases, it really gets down to the nuts and bolts of various political processes.
And Julia, same question to you. How do we make sure that students do get a firm grasp of the electoral process and civics education?
Yeah, I'm really glad that, I think it's good that we have that civics as a graduation requirement in the state of Connecticut. It can vary from school to school and district to district, or rather district to district. But, I teach a full year civics course, and I think it's important to dedicate that much time to it. And I think, piggybacking off of what David said, that it's a matter of both making sure that we build our instructions so that students can understand the ins and outs of how the electoral process works, and then really grounding it in an understanding of why it matters to them, because students are going to learn and remember things that they care about. And so making those connections for how it will impact their life, I think, is just really key.
Well, thanks for helping make those connections for us this morning, Julia. You've been listening to Julia Miller, who is a civics teacher at the Metropolitan Business Academy Interdistrict Magnet School in New Haven, as well as Dr. David Bosso, who is a social studies teacher at Berlin High School. Super thanks to both of you for joining us this morning.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for having us.
And coming up next, we have our own Connecticut public reporter, Abby Brown, who will join us from the polls. And you can also join us for a conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. On this primary day, we've been talking to educators throughout the hour and hearing how they get their students excited about the electoral process. And joining us now to tell us what's happening at the polls in Connecticut is Connecticut Public Reporter Abby Brown. Abby, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning.
And you can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So first things first, Abby, what polling station are you calling from? And did you see a lot of people out voting today?
So I'm actually currently at our New Haven office, but I was previously at the polling station here in New Haven. It is the previous City Hall. It's now the Hall of Records. I believe it's behind the current City Hall. And there were not many people there when I was out this morning.
That does reflect my own experience when I covered the primaries last year. So not super exciting, or not. It is exciting, but just not a lot of people out there. But we did hear about some redistricting happening in New Haven that I believe added to some confusion there. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, so in August, so last month, New Haven finalized some of the redistricting that it did for where residents were to vote, and in some cases, which aldermen represented them. And the maps on New Haven's city website showing who is going to be voting where weren't uploaded until, I believe, last week. And therefore, some people weren't really sure where they were voting. It actually just so happens that one of the other reporters from CT Public that I was out with lives in New Haven, and he, while we were out, said, "Oh, this is actually my polling station. I'm going to stop and vote while we're here," only to find out that his location had been changed and he didn't know. So now he has to kind of reschedule and see where he can fit it in later today.
Wow.
So that did, and I saw some other online, saw some other people kind of commenting similar stories.
That there's nothing like a live learning. That's pretty incredible. Well, we're going to take a moment to hear from one voter that you spoke to. This is a lifelong New Haven resident, Charlize Bromell. She cast a ballot in the absentee box this morning.
Yes, people should have the right to vote who they want to vote. You know, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, or independent, they should have that right to vote who they want to.
And so what else are you hearing from voters this morning, Abby, when you ask them, how do you see the role of primary elections?
To be honest, people didn't have a ton of input on primaries. As we've kind of heard over the last hour, a lot of people were there because they just felt it was their civic duty. I'm going to go and I'm going to vote. When I asked Charlize there about voting in primaries and whether she believes that there should be open primaries in Connecticut, that was her response. She said that she believes you should be able to vote regardless of your party affiliation. I asked a couple other voters that I encountered, and some of them said, I don't really have an opinion either way, to be honest. And I just come out because it's time to vote. They don't really think about primary versus general election.
Right. And I think that does reflect our conversation this hour. So it'll be really interesting to see how the general elections go. And with that too, how are things going on at the poll booths when you were there? Were there any reports of technical issues that were preventing people from casting their ballots, or was it smooth sailing?
It was pretty smooth sailing, I think, particularly considering how slow of a morning it was. Again, as we heard over the last hour, primaries are not often heavily attended, if you will. And that has kind of proven to be the case this morning as well. And therefore, things were pretty smooth. The only confusion or snag was, for some people, the voting location change.
Well, I hope he found his voting location eventually.
I'll have to check in.
Yes, please check in and let us know. And you've been listening to Abby Brown, who's a reporter at Connecticut Public. Thank you so much, Abby, for being on the show and sharing your experience.
Thank you.
And for all primary results, listen live to The Wheelhouse with host Frankie Graziano and a panel of reporters from across the state Wednesday at 9 a.m. and 8 p.m. on Connecticut Public. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.